it is time for another one of the greatest stories never told. Despite his unceremonious exit from the industry in 1962, Bernard Krigstein remains as relevant today as he was in his prime some 70 years ago, maybe even more so. Over the past few years, Krigstein has finally begun to earn a modicum of the respect due to him and his innumerable contributions to the comic book medium. Much of Krigstein's prominence is due to a lasting interest in the EC publications, which has continued since their creation in the 1950s, influencing generation after generation of writers and artists to come. But Krigstein is most certainly a special case in many regards. His most famous story, Master Race, while widely unknown by many comics fans, fetched an astounding $600,000 at a heritage auction in 2018. Those are the kind of numbers usually reserved for the most iconic pieces of original art. But as I said, a lot of people have never even heard of Master Race. So what makes it so special? Published in 1955 for the inaugural issue of EC's final comic book series, Impact, Master Race is widely considered a hallmark in comics, and without a doubt, one of the most influential stories ever created, drastically altering what many people even thought could be achieved in the medium of comic books. However, Master Race remains the only Bernard Krigstein story that many comic book readers are familiar with, and that is a low-down, dirty shame. Krigstein enjoyed success on virtually every type of comic book that he ever worked on, and he worked on them all. Krigstein was ingeniously versatile when it came to every facet of drawing a comic book, and made innumerable contributions to the medium during his all-too-brief time in the field. As the rest of the world finally catches up to what many of your favorite artists have known for a long time, more and more people are discovering that there's a lot more to Bernard Krigstein than just one single story. And tonight, I want to talk about the genius of one of the most celebrated and yet equally obscure comic book creators of all time, and the real reasons that you've never heard of Bernard Krigstein. Remember, if you enjoy these videos, do me a favor and hit that like button. Think about getting in the comments section below and letting me know. And if you really enjoy what you see, make sure you Hulk smash that subscribe button. If you feel like you're in a position to help the channel grow, think about using the links in the description below to sign up for my Patreon page, make a donation via Ko-Fi, pick up a shirt, or use the join button to sign up for membership here on YouTube. I also personally want to thank longtime viewer and a guy I'm proud to call a friend, Tom Nordley, for help with this video. He spent hours helping me research and edit this information, and it would not have been possible without him. But now, let's get into it. During 1952 and 1953, when the Society was active, Krigstein dialed back his Hillman stories and began working almost exclusively for Atlas, who later became Marvel, although he did do a number of Ziff Davis stories for stuff like Space Patrol and G.I. Joe, as well as at least one romance story for a Lev Gleason publication as well. Chasing the best page rates, as he had been for years, during the tail end of 1952, Krigstein began to transition from one publisher to another yet again, this time from Atlas to their direct competition, DC. While Krigstein was extremely well suited for the material, and he did some really fantastic work for DC, almost exclusively on war titles, it unfortunately involved a familiar and unfriendly face from Krigstein's past, and specifically one from his more recent escapades with the Society of Comic Book Illustrators. While Whitney Ellsworth was credited as the editor on both Our Army at War and All-American Men of War, the titles which Krigstein worked on almost exclusively at DC during this period, the real editor was none other than, you guessed it, Robert Kanigher. Of the 14 stories that Krigstein contributed to DC, DC from 1952 to 1953. 12 of them were for titles which Kanigher edited. His work at DC seemed to be going well. The stories were almost always on time, and Krigstein was always a great fit for war material, given the fact that he didn't really feel the need to glamorize or dignify the subject, but rather treat it as realistically as the source material would allow him to. By this point, Krigstein was well used to not being the most popular guy in the room, but if there was tension between the two beforehand, following Kanigher's hateful speech at the Society of Comic Book Illustrators meeting, the two men's relationship completely devolved into acrimonious, vitriolic hatred, at least on Robert Kanigher's part. In an interview which was allowed to be released only after his death, the extremely opinionated and, how shall I put it, abrasive Robert Kanigher stated that he thought Krigstein was a pretentious man who took his craft too seriously. Kanigher went on to claim that Krigstein, quote, lacked the fundamentals of comics, end quote, and said in the interview that he fired Krigstein for, quote, lying to him, later stating that he, quote, simply wasn't good enough to be needed even for short stories. According to the annotation section of Messages in a Bottle, Comic Book Stories by B. Krigstein, Bernard Krigstein apparently missed a deadline and then lied about the reason for it to Kanigher, as he was in fact actually working on a story for DC's main rival, Atlas Comics. Unfortunately, Kanigher discovered this fact and promptly fired Krigstein, though it feels like he was more looking for an excuse to do so than he had a real reason. Unfortunately, in one of the main interviews where he seems to have gone into any detail, Kanigher repeatedly demanded that the recorder be shut off while he made numerous, quote, off-the-record statements. If that wasn't bad enough, some of the tapes were lost over the intervening years, and today only fragments of that interview remain. However, in what has survived, Robert Kanigher makes an offhand comment in reference to firing Krigstein for, quote, lying to him, which is quickly followed by a snide remark about having fired Arthur Petty for conversely telling him the truth. Now, if you remember, Arthur Petty was one of the other founding members of the Society of Comic Book Illustrators and served as vice president directly under Krigstein. I find it extremely difficult to believe that this interview does not clearly show Robert Kanigher was out to get Bernard Krigstein. While I suppose this vendetta could have resulted from a situation that occurred during Krigstein's original tenure at DC, and was perhaps even conceivably the reason that Krigstein had only done 4 stories for DC at that time, knowing that Robert Kanigher was the man who took the podium and almost single-handedly brought down the Society of Comic Book Illustrators, and from the words he used to describe how he felt about comic book artists in that speech, I think it is highly likely that Robert Kanigher was out to end Bernard Krigstein's career and teach him a lesson he would not forget. He wasn't an artist, no one cared about what he was trying to do, and he could destroy Krigstein and his career at a whim if he so desired. Perhaps to drive this point home, Kanigher got downright malicious. In the interview, Kanigher offhandedly states how he didn't like the way Krigstein drew figures, stating he believed that they were too wide and fat. While I never heard Krigstein speak of it, Kanigher is the first person that I know of who found it necessary to physically alter Bernard Krigstein's art, and he did it without Krigstein's knowledge or consent, as far as I can tell. Robert Kanigher's distaste of Bernard Krigstein's unique figure work is, I'm guessing, why Robert Kanigher felt such a vehement need to alter Bernard Krigstein's original art, as he brought it up directly preceding his statements about said events in the interview. Or at least it was his excuse, which seems to be a recurring theme with Koeniger from what I can tell. Though I can't say for certain. One would guess the story that was altered would most likely be Bernard Krigstein's last for DC, as he certainly would not have done any work for the company following the altering of his art if he had been aware of it, which he likely would have been. As I've pointed out before, Bernard Krigstein just happened to be one of the very few professionals that I know of that made a real habit of looking at and reading the final printed versions of his work at this time. This means he likely would have been acutely aware of any changes made to his meticulously drafted pages. Krigstein's final published story at DC appeared in Our Army at War 14, cover dated September of 1953, and was titled Drummer of Waterloo. However, the original art I found from Drummer of Waterloo showed no signs of tampering, and for what Koeniger did, I would imagine you might be able to tell. Apparently, because Bernard Krigstein drew figures that were, quote, 5 feet tall and 5 feet wide, Robert Koeniger ordered the art department to use a razor blade to cut up and alter Bernard Krigstein's original art. As the art department literally used a razor blade to cut it up to better fit Koeniger's vision of anatomy, I would assume you might be able to tell by looking at the original art. None of the pages from Drummer of Waterloo displayed any signs of tampering, though. If the story in question isn't Drummer of Waterloo, it would likely have been Krigstein's second to last piece, Minutemen of Saratoga, which saw print only a month before in August of 1953 in Our Army at War 13. The only page of original art that I found from Minutemen of Saratoga actually appeared in Messages in a Bottle, comic book stories by B. Krigstein, and it didn't show any signs of being cut up either, and the annotations for the story didn't mention it. I see no reason why Robert Koeniger would have made this story up, so I am guessing it is simply on a page or pages of art that either didn't survive or simply haven't left a photographic footprint on the internet or in any publications as of yet. As this is the first time I'm aware of something this extreme being done to Krigstein's more serious work, it likely set the scene for the hyper-vigilant and extremely aggressive stance Krigstein would take against anyone or anything attempting to alter his work in the future. Krigstein rarely spoke of and was asked even less about his time at DC, but following getting fired from DC, he was subsequently blacklisted from the publisher, and it soon became very evident that they weren't the only ones who seemed to be holding a grudge about the Society of Comic Book Illustrators and their attempt at unionization. By September of 1953, doors were beginning to close instead of open for the talented young artist who at 34 was just entering his artistic prime. For the first time in his illustrious career, opportunities began to dry up and Krigstein found it more and more difficult to procure them. Following his excommunication from DC, Krigstein did manage to eke out about half a dozen pieces for Atlas before the end of 1953, but these assignments were becoming more scarce as well. Not only had word of the Society of Comic Book Illustrators made their rounds, but Krigstein had a growing reputation for being a difficult artist to work with. This was not helped by Robert Koeniger altering his art because he claimed it was terrible, booting him out of DC, and telling people it was because Krigstein had lied to him and missed a deadline. Bernard Krigstein had almost become unemployable by major publishers who didn't want to risk working with a temperamental artist that had a reputation for doing what he wanted rather than what he was told. In interviews, Krigstein states his interest in working with these publishers was simply waning. This might be true, but this disinterest was likely the result of adverse treatment he was experiencing following his unionization attempt. In all honesty, I think that he was in large part simply unable to get many assignments at the publishers he had worked with in the past following the Society of Comic Book Illustrators. Just look at the plummeting number of pages that he did for Atlas, DC, Ziff, and MLJ, to whom he had been a heavy contributor to until the formation of the society. Because of the way he presents himself and the few interviews with him that exists, it's genuinely difficult to ascertain whether he was aware of the reason why, but he was certainly aware that he was not getting work like he used to. In what appears to be an act just short of desperation, reaching back several years, Krigstein got a hold of Harvey Kurtzman to see if his previous offer for work was still good. The two did subsequently set up a meeting to discuss possible assignments. However, rather than give him work himself, Kurtzman instead introduced Krigstein to perhaps the most important figure in his entire career, William Gaines. During a 1978 EC reunion panel with Kurtzman, Wally Wood, and Bernard Krigstein, Harvey Kurtzman stated in no uncertain terms that Krigstein was an absolute nightmare to deal with, calling him a, quote, rugged individualist, and following that up by exclaiming how, quote, sore Krigstein used to make him. This is ironic because Harvey Kurtzman had an extremely similar reputation among many that he worked with as well. Kurtzman was nothing short of an absolute control freak, and things had to be done just so for him. A fact which the always astute Krigstein actually points out in retort during the 1978 panel. Working with someone like Bernard Krigstein was not something he was willing to entertain. This is likely the major motivating factor behind Harvey Kurtzman not swooping Bernard Krigstein up for work on his own titles. William Gaines, on the other hand, was a pretty liberal guy and held quality art in fairly high regard, being one of the few major publishers who not only didn't require any sort of house style, but also routinely allowed his pencilers to ink their own material. All things that would have greatly appealed to Krigstein regardless of the circumstances. Though he did have his foibles, Gaines was, at least in his own estimation, willing to pay for quality rather than quantity, employing many of the unquestionably greatest artists to have ever worked in comics. While admittedly EC didn't offer the top page rates, a fact that had previously given Krigstein pause when it came to joining the EC stable of talent, unlike most publishers, William Gaines at least didn't disagree with many of the ideas presented by Bernard Krigstein and his former Society of Comic Book Illustrators about living wages, taking pride in the art inside of comic books, as well as not simply treating writers and artists like disposable objects. This is something not a single one of the other major publishers could claim, and though the pay might have been lower, William Gaines offered Krigstein a job at what otherwise could have proven an even earlier and more hasty exit from the industry. Instead, William Gaines and Bernard Krigstein entered into a partnership beginning in September of 1953 that would change the face of comics forever and produce some of the most important, influential, and respected stories of the entire medium. It was a fruitful partnership, to be sure, but one which would ultimately, unfortunately, last only 2 short years until sometime around August or September of 1955. While William Gaines might have tolerated Bernard Krigstein's liberal thinking, this tolerance and leniency did not extend to the rigid EC editors whose word was law around the EC offices, especially Al Feldstein. Like Harvey Kurtzman and Bernard Krigstein himself, Feldstein was a decisive man and had a difficult time allowing anyone to deviate from how he envisioned the material he wrote. As a result, Krigstein and Feldstein would clash repeatedly in a series of escalating confrontations during his all-too-brief stint at EC. Instead of scripts to work from, EC artists were provided with inflexible pre-lettered page layouts, which they were expected to follow. This forced the artists to retain the rigid structure presented to them, ensuring artists didn't stray too far from the wildly successful and easily recognizable EC House format and formula that their titles followed. Krigstein, however, was not a fan of this approach. Instead, believing that the penciler should have the most control over the story, he continually approached editorial about radically rearranging the meticulously pre-planned structure and layouts he was being given without success. Despite repeated debates with Feldstein on the subject, as well as some reported discussion with William Gaines himself, Krigstein was forbidden to tamper with the layouts of the stories he was given. While extraordinarily frustrating for Bernard Krigstein, this ongoing conflict would continue to build until it inadvertently led to perhaps the most famous editorial fight and single most important story in comics history. After only a few short months with EC, it had become clear Krigstein had no compunction about going to editorial to argue his case when he thought he had a better way to tell a story than as presented by the rigid, pre-lettered pages he was being given. This was not a problem for Krigstein. For editorial, and Al Feldstein in particular, it most certainly was becoming one. Now, with history this old and which went undocumented for so many years, you kind of get into some murky territory here. It is hard to tell fact from fiction sometimes, and according to most accounts by others, Feldstein was frustrated with Krigstein's repeated requests to change things, and even more upset when Krigstein didn't bother to ask permission. Things continued to deteriorate until they had a pretty intense clash over the contents of Krigstein's most famous work, Master Race. According to most people, Al Feldstein hated Bernard Krigstein's obsession with adding panels or otherwise straying from the strict layouts the EC's artists were given, and that this was the source of a great deal of the tension between the two. I found absolutely no first-hand information to corroborate this whatsoever. While I was only able to find a single interview with Al Feldstein where he discussed Bernard Krigstein, he not only had nothing but kind words to say about him, but was the most generous and seemed to be the most honest with his commentary on Krigstein. Al Feldstein appeared genuinely dismayed that Krigstein had, as he put it, had the, quote, door slammed on his career, a sentiment it seems that few of Krigstein's other contemporaries ever shared. And this was in 1978, by the way, before anyone starts thinking that Al Feldstein was trying to backtrack to look good. It's my considered opinion that a great deal of the tension between Al Feldstein and Bernard Krigstein was either imagined or simply blown out of proportion over the years. As evidence, one of the hallmarks of Krigstein's EC work was his 6-panel opening pages. In these pages, he completely dispensed with what he considered the wasted space of those gorgeous title splashes the EC is so famous for, in order to satisfy his ever-growing need for more space and more panels to tell the story. This was not only a hallmark of Krigstein's work, but also, according to most people, a source of extreme tension between Al Feldstein and Bernard Krigstein. Why is this important, you might ask? Well, Krigstein held on to his original art, or at least photostats of work that he didn't still own the originals of, and during the Bob Stewart and John Benson interview, they re-examined the art for several of his EC stories and noticed something very interesting. The stories, which, as I mentioned, arrived pre-lettered and laid out from Feldstein, feature those distinctive 6-panel opening page sequences. And it was obvious from the art that there were not paste-ups. This is to say, Krigstein did not tamper with the lettering or the layouts of one piece of EC work that I know of, aside from a single fateful story in April of 1954. Apart from that one assignment, everything else was delivered to him by Al Feldstein, laid out and lettered as it would be published. This indicates that at least the majority of the legendary tales of Krigstein and Feldstein getting into these repeated knockdown, drag-out fights about the altered layouts are probably just that, tales. The story Monotony, completed in October of 1953, would be the first story to feature this signature 6-panel opening page. When they examined the art for Monotony during the 1962 interview with Benson and Stewart, Krigstein himself said he was unsure why the story featured this unique layout. Krigstein postulated that Feldstein was likely trying to, quote, fit 15 pages of story into 5 again, meaning he didn't have room for the opening splash page. But ultimately, Krigstein was unsure why the layout so radically differed from other EC stories. Krigstein did know that he hadn't rearranged anything, nor had he been involved or been given any input on the initial layouts. This means one of two things. Either Al Feldstein was already writing and laying out stories in this fashion, or planning on doing so for whatever reason, before he began working with Bernard Krigstein, or Al Feldstein was attempting to work with Krigstein's artistic eccentricities and constant requests for changes. The main thing that really set EC apart from all other comic books on the stands was their art. And it wasn't just that they had a ton of the best artists that have ever worked in comics, and they did. It went beyond that, though. William Gaines would pitch stories for hours to Al Feldstein until he heard one that he liked, and then Feldstein did something that seems like common sense now, but was revolutionary in the comics industry at the time. He would assign an artist whose personal taste and artistic style fell most in line with that particular piece. Gaines would complain years later that he would sit and seemingly pitch stories to Feldstein for hours and hours until they finally hit on a small list that Feldstein was happy with. Ultimately, this had little to do with the fact that Feldstein was that discerning when it came to the actual artistic merits of the story, and everything to do with finding a story that fit the unique strengths and talents of the stories in the EC stable. My belief that Al Feldstein was likely working to Krigstein's unique strengths is also bolstered by the short but concise and revealing statements that Feldstein made about Krigstein during the aforementioned 1978 interview, where he said, quote, "I think that Bernie Krigstein was shining a light for us to follow in terms of where the comic book should go," end quote. Before offering up this little nugget, EC, quote, "explored a trail. Bernie Krigstein came in and showed us a further trail to go, and I probably, if we had continued, would have adapted my system of working to Bernie Krigstein's ideas. It probably would have resulted in a re-examination of what we were doing at the time in terms of limitations on the artists," end quote. I think that it's most likely Al Feldstein was laying out stories with these 6-panel opening pages, experimenting a little bit, and then intentionally assigning them to Bernard Krigstein and his rather unique artistic proclivities. It's not unlikely that Al Feldstein came up with a 6-panel page layout simply as a way of placating Bernard Krigstein in hopes of quieting his unrest just a little. Either way, however, this work was specifically and intentionally given to Bernard Krigstein to utilize his inclination for atypical layouts and design. Many of Al Feldstein's co-workers often complained about how Al Feldstein took the industry far too seriously, how he wanted to be involved with every facet of the stories, including how they looked and read. Sound familiar at all? Yeah. There is a good chance that Bernard Krigstein and Al Feldstein, who were very much both control freaks, actually didn't dislike each other for this reason, but didn't get along because there was apparently a communication barrier of some type between the two men. Despite their legendary clashes, Krigstein in actuality thought very highly of Feldstein's writing, and said as such on a number of occasions. His major complaint with his EC work in general arose from the fact that he felt he wasn't given adequate room to do Al Feldstein's stories justice. Unfortunately, it seems that Al Feldstein was unaware at the time that Krigstein was in essence attempting to elevate his writing to the level he felt it deserved, rather than mess with it because he was in any way dissatisfied with it or had any aspirations to be a writer himself, which might have been a likely assumption. While there's no arguing that Al Feldstein was rather difficult to work with in many cases, this actually goes a long way in backing up the idea that Feldstein and not Krigstein came up with this altered layout. When you examine the statements made by Feldstein about Krigstein in 1978, they in no way appear to be those of someone who took any pleasure in playing a part in Krigstein's artistic difficulties. He sounds dismayed that he wasn't able to listen to Krigstein more, learn more from him, and almost ashamed of the fact that he played a role in his early exit from the field. Feldstein was also the only professional from this period in Krigstein's life that made such a prophetic statement on Krigstein's lasting contributions to the evolution of the medium. He seems painfully aware, if only in hindsight, that Krigstein was changing comics in radically lasting and important ways, and that this trend would likely have continued indefinitely had he remained in the field. This doesn't sound like the stereotypical tyrannical editor that you hear about getting into screaming matches with Krigstein about layouts on a regular basis. In fact, quite the opposite, making this tale perhaps even more depressing and sad. I should say, despite these unspoken olive branches between Feldstein and Krigstein, who I honestly do believe respected each other a great deal, this should in no way construe that there were not clashes between Krigstein and editorial on a fairly regular basis. Krigstein had no problem with confronting anyone he thought was getting in the way of him telling a story in the best possible way. In one interview, he vividly recalled how he received an assignment in February of 1954 for the story The Catacombs and demanded that it be completely reworked. Krigstein explained to Vault of Horror editor Johnny Craig that he wouldn't be doing the splash page as it had been laid out, which most likely consisted of a single large panel accompanied by the story's title like the other three stories in Vault of Horror number 38. Krigstein instead drew a quick sketch of what he wanted and handed it to Johnny Craig. According to Krigstein, Craig quickly panicked, breaking out in a sweat, nervously telling him that such a radical departure from the provided layout couldn't be done. After a great deal of back and forth, though, Craig finally caved and agreed to obtain permission from Gaines directly for Krigstein to rework the layouts, which he did. The page layouts were completely altered and relettered according to Krigstein's wishes, and Catacombs still stands as one of the best stories the EC ever published, a fact which did not escape the editorial staff at EC, despite the fact Krigstein would receive few accolades for his work or contributions from them. It is my personal belief from stories such as this that many of the legendary run-ins that Al Feldstein and Bernard Krigstein reportedly had actually took place with other editors at EC, editors who were incapable of appreciating or trying to accommodate Krigstein's constant need to assert control over stories. Despite the fact that Feldstein was invariably wary of constantly being approached by Krigstein to change layouts and panels regularly, he himself admitted it was hard to argue with the results. And while people like other editors such as Johnny Craig might not have fessed up to respecting his work at the time, as I believe they were genuinely tired of Bernard Krigstein and what they perceived as his antics, someone was paying pretty close attention to what he was doing. The changes that Krigstein made to Catacombs would foreshadow the layout of EC's last gasp at books in the form of their Picto-Fiction line, published several years later, which commandeered the appearance of Krigstein's layouts for Catacombs almost entirely. Krigstein was undoubtedly difficult to deal with, but similarly and unarguably, he was a genius in his field. This is likely the major reason he became so highly regarded and acknowledged among his peers only after his retirement, with even his detractors and would-be enemies like Johnny Craig later espousing how much of a gifted man Krigstein really was, despite their repeated disagreements. This is to say that regardless of all the turbulence and back and forth, EC knew they had something special on their hands with Bernard Krigstein. I do believe that Al Feldstein and others did their best to placate his need to experiment and deviate from the norm, but at the same time contained him within what they saw as the boundaries of comics. Krigstein, however, saw no boundaries, only obstacles for him to overcome as he pushed farther and farther away from the established fundamental concepts that people, especially other industry professionals, had about what a comic should be, how it should be constructed, and even what it should be about. As Krigstein eschewed established formats more and more, he became utterly convinced that there were no limitations to comics save for those imposed on him by others. In response, his demands became even more extravagant in the eyes of his employers, who struggled the tightrope walk of allowing Krigstein creative freedom while still producing a story that adhered to their recognizable house style. While he had asked to change layouts and dispense with splash pages before on pieces like Catacombs, things would reach entirely new levels with the story Master Race, widely regarded as the most important and often the best comic story ever produced. Master Race is an extraordinarily powerful story about the specters of the Holocaust, ones which still roamed alive and well at the time, and is as serious a story as you're likely to find in comics even today. For anyone familiar with the story behind Master Race, it's basically open knowledge that given the subject matter of the story and the strength of the script, Krigstein believed that the story had to have more space. Originally written as a 6-page story intended for publication in Crime Suspense Stories number 26 in December of 1954, Krigstein fought to double the page length to 12 pages as well as be given additional time to work on the story. Krigstein believed that Master Race was unlike anything he'd been allowed to work on before and required sufficient room because of its importance in dealing not only with Nazi extermination camps, but Holocaust survivors and war criminals still on the run. It's extremely important to remember at this point in 1954, the Holocaust was simply not being discussed. Master Race would be one of only a handful of stories to do so. And I don't think Krigstein took this fact lightly. It was an inflammatory and touchy subject, well illustrated by the uproar concerning a documentary which had come out that same year, Nuit et Brûlard, or Night and Fog. Probably butchered that. There had been several attempts by different countries to outright ban Night and Fog for a few reasons, but they all stemmed from the fact it was even discussing the Holocaust. Bernard Krigstein, the man who most said took his job too seriously, had found the story he'd spent his entire career searching for, and he wasn't going to back down easily. While Krigstein argued that the page count had to be doubled, Al Feldstein reportedly claimed that 8 pages was the longest story that they could run. This is true only in as much as EC published mostly 6, 7, and 8 page stories. Therefore, making the formatting of an issue around a story with an odd page count would have been more difficult than the traditional and requested 6-page length. While Krigstein was undoubtedly disappointed he didn't get the requested 12 pages, he was at least partially successful in his lobbying and was allowed an extra 2 pages and granted more time to work on the story. Krigstein spent an entire month working on Master Race, twice the amount of time he usually spent on a story. To get permission to rearrange the layout for Master Race, though, Krigstein had been required to make a deal with William Gaines directly. Gaines reportedly agreed to publish the 8-page story, but he refused to pay to have the story relettered, a task Krigstein would himself be expected to complete in the extra time allotted. Krigstein was so taken by Master Race, so consumed by his desire to create the best story that he possibly could, he laid out, penciled, inked, and colored it on his own as well. While many sources cite Mary Severin as the colorist, a belief bolstered by Krigstein's repeated complimentary attitude towards her work, Severin recalled in a 1986 interview that she had in fact colored very little of Krigstein's work, and specifically noted he had colored, quote, the one with the Nazi in the subway. While Krigstein was an early proponent of preserving original artwork, thankfully, so was William Gaines, because Gaines retained every piece of original art that he ever published with the exception of a single Weird Science fantasy cover by Frank Frazetta. And believe you me, I'll be sharing that Weird Science famous funny story as soon as I can finish a few things. Gaines kept and pristinely preserved the original art for Master Race, and frankly, it is amazing to see. Krigstein used a razor blade and painstakingly cut the entire original layout apart before then reassembling it like a jigsaw puzzle. Bernard Krigstein slaved over the 8-page story for weeks and produced one of the most radical and important stories ever published. He was paid a mere $43 a page for Master Race, $2 more than his regular page rate for the extra time and effort, while crafting what is widely considered the greatest comic story ever written. 65 years later, in 2018, the original art for the relatively unknown Master Race sold as a lot in a heritage auction, shattering sales projections for an incredible $600,000, an undeniable testament to Krigstein's talent and unparalleled achievements with the story. Back in 1954, finally, after more than a month of laborious work, Krigstein had assembled and successfully submitted his magnum opus. Master Race was completed and ready on time for Crime Suspense Stories 27 in January 1955, but January came and went, and EC didn't run it. In fact, Master Race would sit collecting dust for months. According to some accounts, the story just didn't fit in the issue or those that followed because of its length. Others contend that there was a growing level of animosity between Krigstein and editor Al Feldstein, who, while he reportedly knew the story was too good to not publish, was hell-bent on proving a point to Krigstein about not being difficult. Clashes between Feldstein and Krigstein were no secret, but what the 1962 Stuart Benson interview makes abundantly clear is how strange these arguments actually were. At one point, Krigstein is asked if he was unimpressed with Feldstein's writing, and that's why he felt the need to alter Master Race. Krigstein vehemently denies this. He then goes on to talk about how he thought Al Feldstein's writing was actually very good, but that the stories needed to be given more space. Krigstein thought that multiplying the number of images and keeping the same amount of text, what he called stretching a 5-page story over 15, was where EC should have been headed. Krigstein was, in essence, arguing with Al Feldstein that Feldstein's own writing was simply too good to be condensed down to EC's standard 6 to 8 page stories, which Krigstein referred to as digest editions and referenced the abridged Reader's Digest versions of books which he abhorred. He insisted that these digests should instead be stretched over a few more pages to allow them the proper dramatic pacing and timing to develop. For reasons that are unclear, Al Feldstein never seemed to get this. While Feldstein would say years later in 1978 that Krigstein was right in hindsight and that EC should have been expanding their stories and making them longer, in 1954 the disagreements continued. It's a real shame because honestly, Krigstein likely thought more of Feldstein's writing than he did, and I'm not sure that Feldstein was even ever aware of that. Personally, regardless of the two men's standings with each other, I've never bought that Al Feldstein sat on Master Race for a reported 10 months because of some editorial grudge. It's no doubt that Al Feldstein knew Master Race was something special. Even William Gaines knew it was different. They must have wanted to publish the story pretty badly, otherwise they would never have granted Bernard Krigstein the extra pages, the extra time, or the extra pay to work on the story. And especially because, as far as I know, Master Race is the only EC story that was ever expanded at the artist's request. Master Race most likely ended up sitting so long because it was controversial. Everyone might have seen how amazing it was, but they must have also been acutely aware of how controversial a story concerning the Holocaust, and in particular extermination camps, would be as well. I mentioned the controversy surrounding the Night and Fog documentary before. This, as well as the general atmosphere surrounding discussion of the Holocaust, probably had a lot of people in the entertainment industry really spooked about attempting to do anything concerning the subject. To further complicate matters, William Gaines had testified on April 21st, 1954, as part of the Senate subcommittee hearings on juvenile delinquency. He was the only publisher foolhardy enough to take the stand and disastrously not only took credit for the invention of, quote, horror comics in these United States, but was also completely out of his gourd on legal speed, and according to William Gaines himself, began to essentially get the nods towards the latter half of his devastatingly self-sabotaging testimony as the effects of his medically prescribed weight medication wore off. Following the Senate subcommittee hearings, EC and William Gaines in particular had a giant kick me sign taped to their back, but the troubles for Master Race didn't end there either. During the Senate subcommittee hearings, a particular cover had been brought before the delegation. It featured a woman's decapitated head in the foreground and a man's hand clutching a bloody axe from the waist down. It was this cover, the cover to Crime Suspense Stories number 22, that is credited as being the damning piece of evidence and testimony that sunk EC and William Gaines entirely when he was asked if he thought the cover was in bad taste, to which William Gaines obviously replied no. What the Senate subcommittee hearing didn't know was that William Gaines had found the cover in bad taste and had already had it censored. But by the time William Gaines stepped off that stand, it was a moot point. Master Race was set to appear only a few issues later in the very same title, which had already just made the front page of the New York Times concerning its content. Crime Suspense Stories and EC in general were in trouble. Quite frankly, there was no coming back from being labeled as the cause of juvenile delinquency simultaneously by the mainstream media, the public, and the government. Despite this, and against all odds, William Gaines, unable to admit defeat, struggled on against the newly founded Comics Code, which was propagated and run by individuals dead set on putting EC Comics out of business. Because Crime Suspense Stories had already come under fire, Krigstein was probably looking for a comic he could fit the story into, but not an issue of Crime Suspense Stories where it could easily prove a lightning rod for the media's ire once more. The problem was, it was an 8-page story, and you were only allowed one of those an issue according to the regular EC house style when it came to laying out a book, where you had the single 8-page story and 3 others at about 6 or 7 pages apiece. Because Master Race wasn't published in the originally intended Crime Suspense Stories issue, it had to bump another 8-page story. And the other stories all had to take this into account. Not an easy feat for the extremely rigid EC, especially given the tumultuous times. Following William Gaines' testimony, things got worse and worse. Some of the things that William Gaines dealt with are absolutely horrific and ridiculous. And if you want to know more about that, check out the EC's Judgment Day episode that I did a long time ago. The video is a little rough, and I do apologize for the language, but that story makes me so mad. I'm almost shaking right now. To see such open oppression and censorship perpetrated by our own government on its own people in this day and age is simply appalling. But contrary to popular belief and lore, I believe William Gaines and Krigstein knew Master Race had to be seen. They were determined to get it out there, one way or the other. As tensions between EC, the Comics Code Authority, and distributors crept to a feverish boil, Master Race languished in Feldstein's office. As the weeks and then months passed, EC's entire line of flagship titles such as Tales from the Crypt and The Vault of Horror were denied distribution and then canceled. William Gaines refused to give in to the Comics Code and submit his books for review, which in turn meant distributors would no longer handle them in many cases, and even when they did get delivered to newsstands, a great deal of them were subsequently returned when the owners noticed that none of EC's titles bore the Comics Code Authority seal. As a result, sales plummeted to a tenth of what they had been only months prior when Krigstein was approached about working on Master Race. The end seemed nigh. The legendary new trend was dying, and EC was clinging onto fiscal life by a bootstrap. Rather than give up, though, William Gaines doubled down and in March of 1955 launched a new title, Impact, in a last-ditch effort to prove that EC was above the Comics Code Authority and didn't need the seal on their books. It didn't work. Impact 1 was released to a narrowing audience, and it seems Master Race never really had a chance. The series was extraordinarily well received, literally doubling the circulation of EC, but because this was from only 10% of their former business to 20%, it was far from enough to save EC's legendary line of books. William Gaines, who had always been rather picky about the printing of his books, began to experiment to save money, producing a second edition of Impact 1 through Charlton Comics. This Charlton version can be easily identified as it features white lettering on the Impact title and vastly inferior printing on the interiors. Gaines was reportedly appalled by the quality of the Charlton printing and would never use the company again. Ironically, even at one of the few publishers that existed which cared nearly as much as he did about the quality of their books, Bernard Krigstein's work, in this case his masterpiece, was being defaced by cheap printing and subjected to various other cost-cutting methods once more. Even with the excellent sales on Impact, all of the cost-saving methods, and the inclusion of what would historically become known as one of the greatest comic stories of all time, Impact 1 could not save EC from the Comics Code Authority. While Impact 1 didn't bear the Comics Code Authority seal, issue 2 certainly did. And not without notice. Even the cover of the second issue was marred by the Comics Code interference. Just look at the man's hand on the cover of the second issue. It was supposed to be holding a gun, but Jack Davis was forced to hastily redraw it by the Authority, excluding the weapon. Impact number 1 would be the final EC comic to ever be published without the Comics Code seal, or their tampering. If Gaines or Feldstein had waited a single issue longer, Master Race likely would have never seen publication. Thankfully, it was released and over the decades has become widely accepted as one of the greatest achievements of the medium, elevating the level of storytelling to new heights and dynamically expanding the visual repertoire of storytelling techniques single-handedly. For Bernard Krigstein, though, 10 months had passed, and even as EC rocketed towards its imminent demise, he had been keeping busy with plenty of other work for the company. Apparently, since taking a razor blade to Al Feldstein's layouts on Master Race wasn't enough to get him fired, Krigstein's reworking of material didn't stop there. Krigstein was given the task of doing new illustrations for a previously published piece, one of William Gaines' favorite stories titled Fall Guy for Murder, which was slated for publication in the inaugural issue of the first title in EC's proposed Picto-Fiction line, Crime Illustrated, in October of 1955. Ironically, this Picto-Fiction line employed many of the same layout techniques that Krigstein had employed and encountered so many problems with editorial over during his time at EC. In the original version of Fall Guy for Murder, from Crime Suspense Stories number 18, published in 1953, a rich husband tricks a private detective into murdering his wife for him with an even more over-the-top and unbelievably contrived scheme than usual. Despite EC's stories normally ending with a twist where the guilty party meets a ghastly and just end, the Fall Guy for Murder story originally closed with the viciously demoralizing scene of the victorious husband gloating over the defeated detective who is cradling the corpse of the woman he's been tricked into murdering, with the husband getting away with his crime scot-free. When Krigstein delivered his inked pages to Al Feldstein, I imagine everything seemed to be in order, and I have no doubt that Krigstein didn't say a word. I don't know how long it took, but when Al Feldstein looked over the art and got to the last page, he had to have instantly known there was going to be a big problem. Believing the story needed a different ending, Bernard Krigstein had drawn a completely different one where things turn out rather differently for the murderous husband who gets his comeuppance. Despite usually speaking rather highly of Al Feldstein's writing, when Krigstein read Fall Guy for Murder, he apparently took great umbrage to the ending, saying, quote, "I do mind very deeply propagating the notion that immorality or crime is moral or good, and I certainly didn't propose to use whatever talents I had in support of this notion." End quote. Take that, Frederick Wortham. Krigstein was called into Al Feldstein's office, and according to Krigstein, told by Feldstein that William Gaines had demanded he complete the story as it had been assigned to him. Krigstein refused. Feldstein, knowing that Krigstein wouldn't listen to him, proceeded to call William Gaines directly. This has been the source of some contention over the years. Many believe that this was because Fall Guy for Murder was one of Al Feldstein's favorite stories. In reality, most evidence suggests it was actually one of William Gaines' favorite stories, and that Al Feldstein knew he would be in for it if William Gaines discovered that Bernard Krigstein had been tampering on what was supposed to be the simple job of redrawing a previously published comic book story in the new Picto-Fiction format. Bernard Krigstein had finally gone too far. He was told that he would either redraw the ending as it had been assigned, or that he would no longer continue working for EC. Krigstein calmly informed them that he wanted his name removed from the story entirely, and that they would have to find another artist to redraw the ending. Obviously a man of irreproachable standards, Krigstein walked away from EC Comics without another word or even looking back. The last story from his most acclaimed period, marred by art from a completely different artist, and Krigstein's name removed from it altogether, at his own request nonetheless. And just in case you're wondering, Reed Crandall was the guy that they called to replace the aberrant ending by Bernard Krigstein, and he's the one who received credit for the work. He does his very best Bernard Krigstein impression, and from what I've heard, Reed Crandall respected Krigstein an inordinate amount. The art really doesn't look bad, but once you know this fact, you can clearly tell Crandall provided the final page, not Bernard Krigstein. While there is a series of illustrations for Mad 26 done by Bernard Krigstein, which were published in November of 1955, around the time of this confrontation, it is my belief that this work was done prior to the falling out with EC over Fall Guy for Murder. Krigstein's relationship with Mad editor Harvey Kurtzman was strained from the start, to say the least, and I don't see Kurtzman bailing him out or giving him work following a major confrontation with his publisher William Gaines, with whom he was having considerable trouble with by that point himself. Despite being the reason for Mad's conversion to a magazine during 1955, which was done by William Gaines as a bid to keep him around, Kurtzman would leave Mad by 1956 over business disputes with Gaines having to do with the ownership of Mad. Krigstein never felt like his work satisfied Kurtzman and said he knew it wasn't what Kurtzman, quote, wanted. Despite this, Krigstein had a deep admiration for Kurtzman and contributed 2 highly regarded stories for Mad by this point, From Eternity Back to Here for issue 12 and Bringing Back Father for issue 17. In fact, Bringing Back Father, done with artist Bill Elder, is one of the most interesting stories Krigstein ever worked on, in my opinion. It's a parody of the unbelievably long-running newspaper strip Bringing Up Father. Krigstein and Elder's Bringing Back Father's story showcases another of the extremely interesting artistic choices which Krigstein has become synonymous with: the employ of opposing or radically differing art styles in the same story. Krigstein provided pages of stark realistic violence interspersed with Elder's take on the iconic cartoon world and applicable physics of the fictional Bringing Up Father world, where violence is fanciful and has no real lasting repercussions. The result is terrifying leaps between the fictional cartoon world of whimsical violence provided by Elder and depressing, horrific scenes of brutality as depicted by Bernard Krigstein. This usage of multiple art styles was something Krigstein had toyed with his entire career and would continue to do so during his time in the industry. While some sources have claimed that the two artists' collaboration was Kurtzman's idea, I don't believe that this was the case. Krigstein repeatedly said that he tried to work with Kurtzman, not the other way around. He also believed Kurtzman was unsatisfied with the work that he turned in on the few occasions when they actually did work together, a fact he makes clear at the 1978 convention panel. Harvey Kurtzman shared a lot in common with Bernard Krigstein and was extremely interested in the quality of the art being produced, as well as being a meticulous draftsman himself. Unfortunately, Harvey Kurtzman, much like Al Feldstein, did not get along with Bernard Krigstein, likely because they were all extremely controlling, rigid, and demanding visionaries decades ahead of their time. Krigstein was a big fan of Kurtzman's, but while Kurtzman obviously respected Krigstein's body of work, I've never felt there was a mutual amount of respect between the two men. However, Krigstein just never seemed to pick up on this kind of stuff. Years later, he talked about how he had tried over and over again to get a project going with Kurtzman, and it would just fall apart on him every time. At the 1978 EC Comics convention, as transcribed in issue 8 of the Squatron magazine, once again rescuing priceless historical information from the maw of oblivion, there's a rather awkward exchange that probably explains why their plans always seem to fall through, where Kurtzman is asked about his relationship with Krigstein. Kurtzman tries to dance around the subject and approach not getting along with Krigstein rather gently before finally admitting he thought Krigstein was a real hassle to work with, despite and probably because of his high standards, to which Krigstein responds by apologizing before exclaiming he had no idea he was such a pain. And it feels very real. Krigstein genuinely didn't mean to cause problems and didn't feel like he was in a lot of cases. He was just out to tell the best possible story that he could, even if that meant bending the rules or the script a little, and I'm not sure that he knew that ruffled so many feathers or upset so many people. By 1955, William Gaines certainly, as well as most likely Al Feldstein, wanted Krigstein gone, and having pawned Krigstein off on Gaines originally to begin with, it doesn't seem like Harvey Kurtzman was very interested in keeping him around after their few projects together left such a sour taste in his mouth either. Despite the extreme level of quality that Bernard Krigstein continuously produced, basically every single editor and publisher he ever worked with couldn't deal with Bernard Krigstein. They simply could not handle his impossibly high standards and uncompromising attention to detail when it came to the quality of every aspect of the work he was producing. He demanded Hillman allow him to ink his own stuff. He demanded the EC give him more time, money, and pages. He cut up their layouts with a razor blade. These things were all in service of his greater goal of evolving the medium and telling innovative and entertaining stories, but they certainly did not earn him many friends inside the industry at that point. Driven by forces I think that only someone like Steve Ditko could truly begin to comprehend, Bernard Krigstein was beginning to paint himself into a corner, and following his falling out with the EC, he was quickly running out of employment options as well. Krigstein just didn't seem to do well with being told what to do, at least not when he had a difference of opinion. The thing is, he often seemed to have a difference of opinion, By this time in 1955, following Krigstein's departure from EC, the Senate subcommittee hearing on juvenile delinquency had taken place, and EC and other publishers were being forced off the racks and all but entirely out of business, and there was a general sense that comic books might not be around much longer by a lot of professionals in the industry. All of this helped to draw the heat off of Krigstein, whose transgressions regarding the Society of Comic Book Illustrators were forgiven at least enough that he was allowed to return to work for Atlas Comics on a regular basis. Historically, many have wondered why Bernard Krigstein, a man so obsessed with the quality of his work and artistic freedom, would go to work for a company known for such cheap, poorly produced comics and being just as editorially strict as anywhere else Krigstein had ever been employed. I'll admit, I had always assumed it was more or less out of desperation. It turns out, as always, Krigstein had an ulterior motive, one which I'd never considered. At a larger publisher, Krigstein was part of a bullpen of artists. Krigstein also worked mostly on short stories between 4 and 6 pages long, which appeared in anthology books that contained stories by a multitude of other writers and artists. With so many writers, artists, and stories for each title, it was apparently fairly easy for Krigstein to keep his head low and avoid editorial coming down on him for his artistic liberties, of which he began to take many. Krigstein pushed relentlessly to further evolve his craft despite extremely constrictive page count limitations and having to avoid the watchful eye of editorial. If you read the 1962 Stuart Benson interview, or really if you just examine his work, you'll notice that Krigstein was obsessed with controlling time, pacing, and atmosphere through panel and page layouts, as well as an extremely varied artistic approach. He could seemingly slow a single moment in time until it almost felt frozen, elongating seconds over panel after panel to convey some of the smoothest and most effective movement I've ever seen, creating a series of images representing the nanoseconds passing in between them, seeming to stretch the moment out indefinitely. This signature reoccurring panel layout, inspired primarily by a painting by Duchamp, Nude Descending Staircase No. 2, along with shots from French New Wave cinema films, especially Fellini films of this era, is just one example of the multitude of radically different styles of panels and layouts which Krigstein employed throughout his career, attempting to perfect his mastery of visual storytelling. He could entirely alter the atmosphere of an entire page just by manipulating the way he designed and laid out his panels. This artistic versatility was his passion. It was the thing that set comics apart from all other forms of storytelling. It made comics special and unique, and Krigstein was determined to unlock all of its secrets. When examining Krigstein's most famous work, Masked Race, done for EC Comics in 1954, you notice a distinct manipulation of time accomplished entirely through these unique panel layouts almost right away, and it's utilized to varying degrees throughout the story to stretch moments of horror and examine certain moments in what would almost be frame by frame, seeing the terror on Reichman's face as he meets his final demise. These exacting examinations of character movements are all almost invariably silent as well, something that you just did not see in comic books from the 1950s, and a fact which earned Krigstein a fair amount of grief during his tenure in the industry. But by removing words, Krigstein could even more effectively toy with the mechanisms of time, pacing, and atmosphere, creating an almost montage of images representing smaller actions which fit together to represent a larger, more profound and complex act, rather than simply spell that one singular big action out on its own in a splash page. Krigstein found these splashes to be wasteful and lacking the impact of tight, readable panels which more accurately portrayed information in his opinion. Krigstein's use of silence to create ambience and mood apparently owed much to Krigstein's love of French art films and their tendency to hold long, lingering shots that don't necessarily have any meaning to them, but rather help to reinforce or create an atmosphere and mood. It was when the talking and the music stopped and the audience had to use their imagination and their mind that they became truly engaged in the work, in Krigstein's opinion. Much like the white space in between panels. In the Stuart Benson interview, Krigstein says that only by exploring what occurs between the panels, the place where things actually happen, the place of actual interest, instead of lingering on the big glamorous spreads and splashes, can the art form of comics ever truly evolve. He goes on to say that as long as artists only consider the meaningless action that actually transpires in the panel, on the page, as opposed to what takes place in between one panel and the next in the world, where those characters truly live and breathe, the medium is cursed to remain infantile. It was really interesting listening to the critically lauded and highly respected Chris Claremont on the recent Cartoonist Kayfabe Shoot interview talk about basically the same thing almost 70 years later. While Chris Claremont has enjoyed a long and lauded career in comics, for Bernard Krigstein, the clock was ticking as he labored away in the Atlas bullpen on science fiction schlock, hokey monster stories, and the occasional war piece. This lack of quality scripts and stories wouldn't stop him from trying his best to explore any new avenue for expanding his art that he could imagine, though. As we've discussed, Krigstein had spent the better part of his career tampering, testing, and experimenting with panel layouts, so during the second stint at Atlas, where he was usually only given 4 pages to tell a story, rather than fight and lose with editorial about layouts or page counts, Krigstein relentlessly began dissecting and analyzing how to utilize this space in the best and most efficient ways possible. Krigstein's layouts started to include more and more panels on the same amount of pages. For some, the panels would have been an excess, but for Krigstein, they were essential. He was determined to compress that 15-page story into 4 pages. Somehow. His exacting standards and incomparable eye for details never faltered and allowed him an incredible manipulation of the laws of time and space across even the most minuscule page counts. During his time at Atlas, Krigstein dispensed with splash pages once more as he increasingly began to experiment with his extreme panel layouts. It seems at a certain point he had decided the way to cram that 15-page story into 4 pages was by making 1,000,000 smaller panels. By the time that Atlas called him out on what they thought was excessive panels, Krigstein had managed to get 75 cogent and readable panels into a 4-page story. They Wait Below, done for Uncanny Tales number 42. It is an amazing thing to behold, at least to me. Stan Lee, however, did not agree with this sentiment, if he ever did little more than put up with Krigstein from his perspective. According to Krigstein, Stan Lee requested that some of his excessive panels be removed to make room for his quaintly flavorful text on the Phantom of the Farm in World of Fantasy number 9 from December 1957. This seems to have been the straw that broke the camel's back, with Krigstein's disgust for Lee being almost palpable when he's brought up. Bernard Krigstein was done. He immediately objected, telling Stan Lee that they in fact would not be changing his art. Lee, who is not used to being told no, then demanded that the panels be changed by Krigstein. He insisted that if Krigstein would not change the art, they'd simply hire someone who would. Krigstein responded to this by then proceeding to tell Stan Lee that if Atlas altered and published his art without his consent, he would straight up sue them. Absolutely fed up with the system at this point, Krigstein decided no one was going to be changing his work, and he was finished being told what to do, and there's absolutely no doubt he was not joking about suing Atlas. One of his last employment options In the mercenary field of freelance comic books of the 1950s, this was basically unheard of and tantamount to career suicide. I don't think Stan Lee or Atlas knew quite how to react to the threat of a lawsuit, honestly. There were excruciatingly few people who took comic books anywhere near approaching this seriously when it came to anything but the money involved. It's not entirely clear how this situation played out, as far as whether Lee and Atlas outright fired Krigstein then and there, or Krigstein chose to leave Atlas following his dispute over the art. What is clear is the art ran untouched, as Krigstein had drawn it for They Wait Below. I also know that the next 4-page story he would do for them, published in February of 1958 in Strange Tales 61, would be his last work for Atlas in any incarnation. Krigstein was finally beginning to reach the end of his contacts list for assignments, and his workload showed it. Following the publication of Krigstein's final work for Atlas at the beginning of 1958, for the first time since he entered the field professionally, Krigstein would be very nearly absent from the stands, producing only a single illustration published by DC for Flippity and Flop in 1959. Following Flippity and Flop, Krigstein stopped working in the industry for almost a full 3 years. It seemed the gig was finally up and Krigstein was completely out of the game. In 1962, however, Krigstein was approached to do what he referred to as, quote, the most fantastically absurd story that has ever been typed. Krigstein was far from impressed with the story, though he did eventually take on the work, which was titled Blind Man's Bluff, set for publication in the second issue of 87th Precinct. Blind Man's Bluff is indeed as fantastical as Krigstein would lead you to believe, with a world-famous and secretly blind sculptor driven to murder a mute model who has discovered his disability in an even more over-the-top production than the most ham-fisted of EC's contrived tales. While he did the job and the story did see print, it seems like the love was kind of gone when you look at Blind Man's Bluff, like somehow his interest in comics had finally been completely sapped. When the same people subsequently called for a proposed story in the next issue, which Krigstein thought was, quote, even stupider than the first one, he politely declined the offer. The work had finally dried up, and branded a traitor because of his efforts to unionize with the Society of Comic Book Illustrators and inexorably linked with the universally despised EC Comics, Krigstein was tired of pounding the pavement looking for it. With this quiet bow, Krigstein effectively exited the industry, which he had so valiantly and tirelessly strove to better for nearly 2 decades. At the age of 43, at the height of his artistic skill and talent, Bernard Krigstein could no longer afford to stay in the comic industry. It was just after his refusal of this second story that the original 1962 Stuart Benson monograph interview was completed. During this interview, he states he's completely lost interest in comics, and when the interviewers bring up Stan Lee and the Marvel Age that's just really hitting its stride, and being heralded as saving the industry, Krigstein lets loose with one of the harshest quotes I have ever heard. I was delighted to learn that Lee has attained the status of an authority in the comics field. 20 years of unrelenting editorial effort to suppress the artistic effort, encourage miserable taste, flood the field with degraded imitations and polluted non-stories, treating writers and artists like cattle, and failure on his part to make an independent success as a cartoonist have certainly qualified him for this respected position. It's not only terrifying how prescient this quote would prove to be over the following decades, but it's also a great example of just how disenfranchised Bernard Krigstein had become with comics. He goes on to say they've become absolutely banal, and that as more and more people have begun to read them again, he's completely lost interest. When asked, Bernard Krigstein callously dismisses even Will Eisner, saying that he hasn't read Eisner's work in years, but that he relied too heavily on the shortcuts and therefore the cliches and tropes of cartooning. Krigstein, sounding like a teacher chiding a student, says that he's capable of so much more than what he's doing. This espousal, I think, is a wonderful analogy for Krigstein's career. Eisner would be driven to create the acclaimed graphic novel A Contract with God years afterwards, For essentially this very reason, Eisner himself felt he was capable of so much more than what he had been doing. Krigstein comes off so cold and so callous in panels and interviews, and he might have been, but he was also almost always right. Krigstein saw the potential in comics, he analyzed all the angles and decided that he was never going to be allowed to do his Fahrenheit 451 book or his War and Peace. The industry was too caught up in making a cheap buck to care about the evolution and growth of the medium that Krigstein treasured so deeply. So he just walked away, and he closed the door on that part of his life to the detriment of the industry. While a few people did continue correspondences with Krigstein, Bob Stewart and John Benson, the authors of the original monograph, and a young Art Spiegelman most notably, following his final story and a few EC reunion panels, Krigstein seems to have entirely severed all ties with the industry, becoming a commercial illustrator, painter, and then a teacher once more. Krigstein's artistic techniques, innovative new panel and page layouts, and his meticulous attention to detail when it came to every aspect of the production of a comic book helped to truly expand the visual lexicon and storytelling possibilities of the comic book medium. So while yes, Master Race is unarguably the best thing that Bernard Krigstein ever did, he was so much more than just one story, and he could have been so much more than he was. In the end, though, while Bernard Krigstein's name may not echo through the halls of comic history, that's because his influences are the halls of comic history. His work is the foundation on which so much of what comics became are built on. It's almost unbelievable. Bernard Krigstein was truly a trailblazer and an innovator, and I hope I did him just a little bit of justice with this video.
Thanks so much for sticking with me. I hope you all enjoyed, maybe even learned something. If you did enjoy what you saw, hit that like button. Think about getting in the comments section below and letting me know. Share these videos with your friends, and if you really enjoyed what you saw, make sure you hog smash that subscribe button. If you do that, make sure you ding the little notification bell so you never miss another video or premiere again. If you feel like you're in a position to help the channel grow, think about using the links in the description below to sign up for my Patreon page. For as little as $3 a month, you get access to tons of behind-the-scenes posts, exclusive content like uncut interviews, and you can even get your name in the credits. If Patreon is not your thing, but you still want to support the channel, have no fear. After 2 years of fighting with YouTube, I can finally offer membership right here on YouTube. Just click the little join button and make sure to select the tier and perks that fit you best. You can also make one-time donations towards specific goals or just tip the channel using the Ko-Fi link in the description below as well. If that's not enough, you can even pick up your very own JerkComic shirts like the ones you see on the screen now. As always, this video was made possible by the Jerk Broadcasting Service as well as generous grants from the Patreon members, Ko-Fi donations, and YouTube members you see on the screen now. I'd like to seriously thank every single one of you who has chosen to support the channel. I think the quality of the videos has really been improving, and I just really hope I'm doing you all proud. Most importantly, I hope you all enjoyed, maybe even learned something. Thanks again for sticking with me, and as always, I really, truly, and honestly ask only two things. Keep hitting those local shops, and keep reading comics.